Welcome to Neon Cobra. Thank you for joining us on one of our how-to sessions specifically focusing on cost optimization. So one of my more frequently viewed videos, and quite honestly, one of the more frequently viewed or accessed calls I have with partners is how to derive the most amount of value from their Azure plans and their Azure subscriptions with their clients. And one of the biggest things is kind of expense or cost runoff. It is an ever-moving machine. So I did an earlier video on areas to focus to drive down costing. I'm actually going to walk through the portal today and show you where these areas of focus should be. Now, one thing to note, this is going to be based on a PAX 8 subscription. So depending on who you are partnered with, some of these features may not be available, specifically focusing on the self-serve reservations and savings plans. But with that, thank you for joining, and then let's kick right into it. So what you should be seeing now is the Azure login screen. You have obviously your standard resources, and we're going to go right in first to reservations. So the concept of reservation is locking into a 1 or 3 year term commit on the compute of a specific resource. Now, predominantly, you're going to be doing this on virtual machines. However, there are a plethora of different reservations you can purchase, as you see here. The more common ones will be virtual machines, but you may also inquire into Azure managed disks. Now, this is only applicable for Azure premium disks of 1 terabyte and higher. And the cost savings on those is quite honestly negligible. You only save about 2 to 3% on a disk compared to, say, the virtual machines where it's 40 to 60% depending on the term commit. That is important to know as well, that you forego any backend margin when you lock in reservations. But if you have your MCAI-PP accreditations in solution partner designation and say infrastructure, you would get your 10% on those. That's important because if you're trying to lower your cost to increase your profitability, locking in an Azure disk will have that reverse effect because you forego your margin to do that. If you're doing a fixed rate billing, you have opportunities around that. Another area to highlight is very popular is Microsoft Fabric. So anyone moving from the Power BI SKUs, Power BI Premium Capacity P1 or P2, you're likely going to end up, or you should already be on the Microsoft Fabric 64 or 128. You can severely reduce your costing by locking in the commit terms here. To provision, you would click on virtual machine, and then this will pull from the Azure Advisor, right? It's going to look over the last 30 days usage and provide recommendations on what's been running in the environment. Now, these are loose recommendations. It's not going to go down right to the hour and derive your cost optimization. But it's going to show you likely the VMs that have not shut off for at least the last 30 days and areas where it may be worth locking them in. Now, it's going to be specific to the region. You can actually isolate it down to the regions at the top here. You can determine your turn. It defaults to 3-year monthly most times, which is the highest level of savings you can get with the least amount of impact because you're paying monthly. But you can change these billing term frequencies to full upfront, where you pay for the full term upfront, and you can change it to 1 year or 3 year at that time. Simply choose the recommendation you wish. It will do a quick calculation in USD. Now, for any of my Canadian or international partners, when you add this to cart, it will provide you the Canadian equivalency if the region makes sense. So it'll say, 45.72 USD, and it'll give you your Canadian billing in the bottom there. You have the opportunity to name your reservation, determine whether it auto renews at the end of the 3 year or not. You can adjust your billing frequency and adjust your quantity because it recommended 2, but maybe I only want to lock in 1 because I know I'm shutting the other virtual machine down. So once you do review and buy, this will provision, and within the hour, it'll start protecting the virtual machines. Now, a case note of this, order these as close to the start of the month as possible because it is not retroactive to cover the pay-as-you-go rates. So if you did this at the end of the month, your next invoice would essentially be, 600-700 hours of consumption on the one side, and then a reservation at full price on the other. So then you're almost double dipped. The reverse side of that is at the end of the 3-year term, you don't pay for that last month. You'd get your first, say, 28 days included in the previous reservation before renewal. So you're just kind of pushing it onto the back end. Long and short, just to make it easier for the clients, try to align it with the first or second of the month. There'll be very minor charges, and then your reservation falls in for a net savings on your next invoice. Now, the terms and conditions for the reservations I'll include, there are cancellation penalties potentially in place, as well as a rolling $50,000 USD cap per client on the ability to cancel subscriptions. Doesn't matter too much in some of the smaller reservations, but if you're throwing Fabric capacities in and out and you're locking those in, or SQL database capacities, and you're canceling those on a regular basis, you could hit that $50,000 cap quite fast, which means that if you didn't expect a refund and breaking of term, you may not receive that and you're on the hook for the cost of that reservation. So just be cognizant of that if you're going to swap out reservations more frequently. These should be long-term commits that you are comfortable doing. So the next thing that generally comes hand in hand with reservations is going to be savings plans. Now, savings plans are a little bit, I don't want to say riskier, but a little bit more difficult to position correctly. So whereas a reservation is a one-to-one, you've got, a VM or a disk, you in Canada East, Canada Central, you would take one and lock it into that. If there's any variance, if that virtual machine changes types or anything like that, you would then stop getting the reservation protection and you go back to pay-go rates while still paying for that. Savings plans is essentially committing to a bucket of compute, a generic bucket. So let's say I put $1,000 a month, or $1 an hour, because that's how this bills out. Any compute in my environment that is not protected by a reserved instance will draw from that bucket at the reduced rate agreed upon. And what I mean by agreed upon, in the Azure pricing calculator, if you're looking at a virtual machine, on the left, you will see savings plans and reservations, and they'll have different percentage-based discounts. So let's say it regularly bills at $100 an hour or $100 a month, and the savings plan is a 50% discount, which means it would draw at $50 a month as long as there is a compute savings plan available for it. So hypothetical, normally bills at 100, savings plans discount bills at 50. Let's say I've got a $40 pool to draw from. It'll draw up to $40 from that pool, and then the remaining $10 will revert back to the pay-as-you-go rates. So then the remainder of that month will be at the full rate, so probably around $20 loosely. So the concept of savings plans is if you have volatile compute requirements in your environment, say things like burstable virtual machines. So if you're scaling in and scaling out operating systems and session host for AVD, if you're doing web development with like Kubernetes containers, if you don't know what you need, but you need, right? So you're doing DevOps, you're doing design, you're spinning things up, you're spinning things down. It's really hard to align specifically reservations with that because you're kind of always in flux. So this is where you would kind of go in to set these savings plans. You can set it right down to a specific resource group. So this is very helpful to control the buckets that might be drawing from savings plans. And you can have numerous savings plans in the environment, which is very helpful as well. So if you need to go through and say protect certain areas, maybe for dev, and then everything else is reserved, you can do that there. Now, you have to decide on a 1 or a 3 year term, and that affects the rate at which the compute will draw from the pool. And you have to do an hourly commit in USD. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. You need to be accurate with that because there is no cancellation for this. If I mess up and put $50 an hour in there, I'm on the hook for $50 an hour for the next 3 years. There is no cancellation penalties. So it'll kind of provide you your average at the top there. And really the easiest way to kind of get to this is using the Azure recommendations and the Azure Advisor. But there are some tips and tricks to this that I'm going to kind of navigate at the end. So if you're not quite sure where to start, the Advisor is a good way to go. You can then pay for it all up front again, or on a monthly interval. In this case, it depends on what you're hoping to accomplish. And you can have numerous savings plans. Now, it can be a little bit to navigate that over and over again, right? Because if you've got moving compute buckets or savings plans buckets, not having them data line can be a little difficult. So there's some strategy at play into this, but this is another way you can lower overall costs in an environment if you're really trying to sharpen the pencil. Now, similar to reservations, this is going to remove all margin from that compute bucket. So if you're expecting to retire your backend incentives and backend margin from your distributor of choice, that is gone on this. Microsoft does not pass through your margin. All right. The next item is going to be Azure Hybrid Benefits. So there is a licensing component to this. So when you purchase a subscription software licensing on a 1 or a 3 year, or have previously activated and still valid software assurance, you have the ability to go and attest that you have the licensing. But just having the licensing on the tenant is not enough. To facilitate this, you would go into a virtual machine, expand settings, and look for operating system. Now, I will note there's a before and after scenario in Azure where, depending on the age of the environment, and this might not be the case anymore, but there was over the last year and a half a change in some of these menus. It might not have an operating system. This might be under properties or configuration. Um, I'm not quite sure when the change happened, but they have broken this out. So if you don't see operating system, look for something similar to that under settings. But what you're hoping to see is something similar to this. Oh, okay. So this is a virtual desktop. We'll have to pick a different one that makes sense, but perfect. This is likely what you're going to see, right? There is a licensing section where it says save up to 49% with the license key you already own, right? The explanation of hybrid benefits. If you're not confident, you're not sure what that is, check one of my previous videos. I will link it in the description here. But once you've purchased the licensing, you essentially attest that you have it and you have an eligible subscription. That is it. There is no mechanism in play. There's no key installation, nothing. You're essentially attesting to Microsoft that you are compliant and you have the appropriate keys for this virtual machine. So you as a provider are now responsible for ensuring that that licensing is present, valid, and updated at all times, right? Because there is no activation or check metric at this time to validate that this licensing exists. But when Microsoft comes with an audit, you better be able to present it, right? It's the same as if you were licensing physical hardware in the past. You got a Mac key that could activate 50 VMs, but if they came knocking, you better had enough cores to support those 50 VMs, right? So kind of the same idea here in Azure. So those are quick and easy ways to protect the environment from what, naturalized growth, what you expect. Now we're going to talk about some other cost centers, and one of the most often overlooked thing that tends to chew away at your profitability, and this is orphaned disks. So the concept of an orphaned disk, and the easiest way to find out is just to search for disks in your environment. And then from within there, sort by your owner column. And actually, it looks like we may have cleaned this up. If you have an owner column that is empty, that means a disk is not doing anything. It is not attached to a virtual machine. It's not being referenced in any way. I will caveat, occasionally you'll have an Azure site recovery where you may have disks still attached to a recovery vault, but not attached to an actual machine, which means you likely paused or have shut down the Azure site recovery, but you haven't terminated the service, which means it's keeping these disks kind of online in a different region. Now, the kicker is, regardless of whether you're using these things or not, they cost you money, right? This 256 SSD, that's about $40 Canadian. The premium is about 25. And I've seen on average, almost every environment I go into, unless it's being maintained meticulously, there's always one or two. And a lot of the causes for things like that are maybe there was a session host rebuild, and during the deletion, there was a problem. Maybe during the VM creation, it wasn't selected to purge all resources upon a VM deletion. So when the VM was purged, it left network cards and things like that behind, right? But what costs the most money in this case is going to be disks. And one of the other big offenders is Azure backups. So when Azure does a backup and recovery, it creates a managed disk of the drive you're attempting to restore. And when that drive is restored and you pull your data, that's great. You have to unmount the disk and you have to purge it after. So sometimes when there's been a couple of recovery instances, and sometimes they're like 4 terabyte file server drives, they could be sitting there for months and you're paying for that. So remember, when you do a rebuild, you do a recovery, make sure when all of this is done, come into here and make sure it's nice and clean. If you're leveraging Azure budgets, which I have another how-to video for that, any sort of orphan disk or anything like that from a recovery standpoint will likely trigger your alerts early, because it'll see almost an immediate increase in costing. So hopefully you catch that early. But it's good maybe every once a quarter or every once in a while, or if you adopt a new client, come in here and take a look. And this is a really good way to lower costs really easy. I will caveat, make sure you know what you're deleting, right? Because sometimes there's been, this is an archive disk. We don't need it attached to anything, but we're keeping it around. You can attach to a VM quickly, take a look at what the content is, and then purge it if you need to. So from the top there, we have some really easy buckets to lower your overall. Sometimes you don't know necessarily where your actual costing is coming from. So this is where I'll leverage tools like cost analysis. Now, this is really dependent on having the Azure Cost Manager activated in the environment. So your CSP can generally control that. I know from Pax8 we can. You can have that enabled or disabled. If you have it disabled, you will not see any of this information. It'll be completely blank. You won't see any costing in Azure. It's all going to be handled through Pax8, and you're invoicing from there. Now, while we do have some tools on the back end, you do lose access to your Azure budgets and the ability to dive into resources. Because unfortunately, Microsoft, via API reconciliation and billing, loops together similar meter transactions. So, say bandwidth, right? Bandwidth could be a single line item and it could be 1 terabyte. But you, as an MSP, need to know, where did that 1 terabyte come from? Cost analysis. So if you have ACM turned on, you can go into cost analysis and choose resources. Resources is going to give you the breakdown of every resource in your environment and their dependencies. And that's the important part. Because it's great to know that I have, $100 worth of storage transaction charges, but what disk caused that? So from in here, you can actually sort from high to low and start expanding out the VMs or the line items in the cost centers and find out what is attributing to that. So if I use this, a little buggy there, let's pull a different one up here. If I use this, I see this test DC is a B2MS and it's cost me $61. But a part of that is an extra $13 for my Defender for servers and an extra $470 for my Cloud Security Posture Manager. You're also going to see bandwidth associated to this and any additional standard data transfer and intercontinental. So if there's any peering, so you can see data and maybe trying to figure out, well, there's a big change in my environment. I've got a lot of bandwidth. What caused it? Oh, it's coming from this one server. Maybe data is being exfiltrated. Maybe there's a problem. Additionally, you'll come down and see these disks. And we'll see if I can find a standard disk here. Test our review. AVD. So the premium disks don't have the storage transaction charges. Man, we've used a lot of premium disks here. Let's see what I can find. There, I don't know. So we have a lot of premium disks in play. I know I've got one here. There we go. So this disk right here will show your storage transaction charges, right? Disk operations. And this is a conversation I'll have, like, doesn't necessarily need to be using premium disks for everything, but sometimes there's a break-even point where it's more cost-effective to upgrade to the premium disk. So anything with databases on it and things like that. So if you're going through and you're like, hey, this like 128 standard SSD that I was expecting to be $14 is $50. What's going on? You come in here, you see your storage transaction charges. So this is a very easy way to kind of go through your environment and understand where your large cost areas are. Quite honestly, your top 10, maybe even like top 5 are going to be the biggest areas of impact you can make to the environment. And then there's the death by 1,000 cuts on everything else. So start with your top 5, top 10, take a look, see what is drawing against your cost, and then make decisions from there. Now, another tool that Microsoft has made available to you is the Microsoft Advisor. Now, as well as providing security, reliability, cost optimization, or performance, it provides a cost center, will provide general recommendations based on what it can see. Now, some of this stuff needs to be taken with a grain of salt, right? So first off, right size or utilize, underutilized virtual machines. This is a good area to maybe look at, but don't do the quick fix because you really need to understand what's happening on that environment. Sometimes we just need the extra resources on that VM for, say, storage transaction, right? Because sometimes the size of the virtual machine dictates the storage transaction performance on the other side for the network attached storage. So you can take a look. If you click into this, it'll tell you the virtual machines, the resources it recommends. It'll even kind of provide a recommendation of where to move it. And a lot of these are actually not too bad, right? Understanding this one should go from a D4 to a D2 does make sense. We don't really do much on that app server. The desktop test to a B series, you know what? That makes sense. And it shows you kind of what's going on and it'll provide you some baseline details. But the look back period is really determined on what you decide. In this case, this was look back over 7, and this was look back over 30. You can postpone and dismiss. So it's a nice way to kind of get an idea of maybe some areas of improvement and optimization in your environment, but take them with a grain of salt. Then it'll recommend reservations and savings plans for non-protected compute. My general recommendation on this is start with your reservations first, right? This will tell you, this is the same recommendations that would happen in the reservation window, but you can see it from a high level and the cost impact it'll have, right? Potential yearly savings on the right here. Now, here's the thing. It's going to recommend reserved instancing and savings plans, but it's not going to be able to distinguish the difference between the two. And what I mean by that is this is an either or scenario at this current time, right? It's looking at the compute resources and recommending an hourly commit for the savings plan. And then it's also looking at the compute resources and doing an or reservation recommendation. So I mentioned earlier at the top, you can do both. But if you're using the advisor to set your baseline commits to the savings plans, you're going to get burned because it's not factoring in what you're about to remove from that bucket by adding your reserved instances. So if I add all of these reserved instances in play, and then I come in and commit $1.62 USD per hour for the demo sub, it's going to be applying those same savings plans to already protected reserved instancing, which means I'm being double billed for no reason. So the approach I recommend on this is do your reservations first and maybe wait 7 days minimum, but I recommend 30 days for the advisor recommendations to refresh. What you will notice then is your savings plans will either vanish entirely or be highly adjusted based on what you need to do. And then your dollar comes down and it'll say based on performance over the last 30 days, the non-reserved compute should now be this per hour. So that's very, very important because while you can cancel reserved instances, your savings plans cannot. And if I commit to $1 something an hour, you're on the hook for that and there's no getting back. So then you just lose money. So again, highly important. Order of operations matter for this. Now, one extra tidbit I'll add at the end here. This is I've talked about this in my Azure links recommendation, but having a way to see your environment really easy for cost, expense, and runoff problems, there is this orphaned resource workbook. And I will link the GitHub for that. But this workbook is actually just a quick view of any orphaned resources in the environment, and then we'll also identify whether they cost money or not. So this is important, right? We're seeing public IP addresses. I've got 4 right now that have no owners assigned to them, and they are costing me money. And I can go to the networks tab and actually see where they are. Oh, I've got an IP address here, an IP address here. And it's like, wait, these aren't assigned to anything anymore. So I can come in and I can click right into the asset itself. Oh, looks like it refreshed the window. But you can go and find the public IP address test PIP. And then from there you go, click into that. You can double check that it's not assigned to anything. And then you can purge that resource, right? Usually IP addresses, you're not keeping them around for any real reason. Let's see if I can get this to refresh. Yeah, a little portal's acting up on us, but the concept still stands. I've got an IP address here that has been orphaned out. It's costing me maybe up to $5 a month, right? Again, death by 1,000 cuts. So while you might start in the Azure cost analysis mode, you can come in here and see what other resources high level. And because this refreshes actively, you can come in here and this will tell you, your disks, your service plans. So while at the start of going in and checking everything from the orphaned disks and the cost analysis review, you could always start with this tool first and then click in to see what's going on. It's also a good way to clean up your environment to understand, like, do I need these items or not, right? I've got 14 subnets here that are no longer active, right? So clean it up, make it easier to manage with your teams, right? This is important, right? So I'll link this in the description below. And, hopefully this is of value to you. I am not affiliated with this in any way. This is just provided by one of my partners, and I thought it was a really great tool to have impacted there. So thank you again. If there's any other how-to videos or things that you think may be of impact to your organization, please let me know. I'm more than happy to do these sessions. I love doing them. And I really appreciate you liking and subscribing to the content. This is how I grow our partner base and kind of hear back more from the community. So with that, catch you next time.